Autism is a complex developmental brain disorder that results in behaviors which are often mystifying to parents. Early intervention for children and parents is key. Find out what helps and hear stories of hope next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center, and tonight we're taking your questions on autism. So call the numbers on your screen right now locally, dial 218-788-2844, or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. You can also text us your questions or email them using the number or address listed at the bottom of your screen. It's guest introduction time. Joining us first is Dr. Charles Orsak, a licensed psychologist at Essentia Health who specializes in the psychological assessment and treatment of children and adolescents. And next to him is Tahara Bushi. She is a speech and language pathologist who specializes in the treatment of young children with autism and their parents. And Julian Kubat is the mother of a child with autism who shares her own story tonight to bring awareness and offer hope to those in similar situations. Thanks to all of you for coming here tonight. I appreciate that. And Julianne, I especially appreciate you because you're kind of delaying your little vacation a little bit just to be here tonight. And it's so gracious that you come to tell your story, and that on top of it, you out there in your living room, give her a great round of applause already. But we're going to start the way we always do, which is identifying for the viewing audience what is autism. And I think we'll start with you and we'll have Tahara add to that.
Well, we would term autism a neurodevelopmental disorder, meaning it's something about the way the child's brain works that affects important parts of development. And for autism, it's really in two basic areas, which is the ability to communicate socially communicate and have reciprocal or two-way relationships. And the other is this tendency to get engaged in sort of fixated interests or repetitive behaviors. And so it's those two areas those three areas of development that are most affected with autism.
And what do you see, and what would you add to that, Tahara?
Well, one of the first signs that a child has autism is that communication's not developing as it should. So that's why speech-language pathologists are often involved. And one of the reasons for that is one of the tricks to learning how to communicate in the first place is understanding the back and forth social relationship between people. And so if you don't understand the back and forth, then language is tough to learn. And so these kids are late talkers. Even if language, the process of learning words and putting words into sentences is not hard for them later, it's still late often for kids because it's so hard to figure it out without that underlying social understanding.
And I'd add, the other piece is the early development of nonverbal communication. So one of the early phases that kids go through is mirroring. You know, you mirror what you see in other people, but that means you have to sort of appreciate and interpret the nonverbal part of communication. And so it's the nonverbal and the verbal part of communication that they struggle with.
Both parts.
Yes.
And in fact, one of the first signs that pediatricians see or look for, ask about, is not pointing, whether kids point at things. Not necessarily to get them, but just to show them, because that's a very social behavior, is looking at something and following that point. Mm-hmm. And so those nonverbal skills we're teaching as much as the verbal skills in the early years.
Because they're not occurring naturally with that child, or people aren't seeing that naturally with the child. And when I spoke with you a couple of weeks ago to hear about coming onto the show, I think you offered up an explanation about how centers of the brains are not communicating.
Right.
Explain that for...
one of the explanations of autism that I found really helpful to my understanding was that you have different parts of the brain that do different things for you. You have the front part that makes decisions and decides to do things. You have the back part that processes vision, yeah, and you have language areas and so on. Well, you have to coordinate all of those things together. So when I, for example, when I see that cup, if someone picked it up and set it back down, I'd have to be able to put together the understanding that that sound came from what I saw, that those two things happening at the same time were related to one another. If my brain didn't integrate that information well, then I would be a little confused and frightened by the sound because I didn't know what happened there. And so children with autism are often confused and frightened by the things that happen around them because they're not integrating the information well from the various areas of the brain. And so they stay in this high stress, I'm not sure what's going on here, state a great deal of the time, which I think leads often, maybe it would occur otherwise, I don't know, but one explanation is that it leads to kids becoming very focused on a narrow thing that they can control and kind of tuning out a lot of the other things in the environment.
Because that becomes their way of managing their
stress.
Their stress of their environment,
right.
that you and I don't have to worry about because we know that sound came from the cup.
Right,
then.
right. And fast-moving information is really hard for kids with autism to make sense of, and there's nothing that's faster moving than social communication. Facial expressions are just, they're there and they're gone in an instant, and kids need to see it, make sense out of it, and act upon it all so quickly. And that's hard for a lot of kids with autism.
And so I think we're going to sort of move a little bit away from the science and that explanation, which I love, but I love that whole idea, the parts of the brain are not communicating. I think that just has such a wonderful understanding. But now we're going to move to the real life example. And I think, Julianne, where I'd like you to start for our viewing audience is that time with your wonderful son before the diagnosis, and what Keaton was like, and then what that was like for you as well.
Okay, well, I'll try and be concise. Keaton was a very fussy baby, and we weren't really sure why. He did not understand connectivity. There was no eye contact, and he did not seek comfort, so he didn't necessarily care to be held. But what I found is that we were going down a slippery slope, that our lives were becoming so dictated by routines, and
how
he
did
would be
that happen?
very sensitive to normal things that an average child wouldn't mind. It would be very upsetting for him to put shoes on. It would be very upsetting for him to go into public places where there might be a lot of people, or it would be a church and it would be very large and have a lot of echoing sound. And little by little, we were finding that the path that we had to move in a daily situation or daily basis was becoming more and more narrow and more complicated. And so finally, it was...
I'm going to interrupt you
yes.
for a second. So, and the narrowing of that path was like, oh, okay, the shoes don't work. Like, that's upsetting. What can I do to not upset this child?
Right. So then we would just take his shoes off when he needed to eat, or we would just put him in socks, and so we would just try and figure out what can we get by with, what's necessity, and how do we come up with a new strategy or a new plan. And that was constantly what we were doing, be it for feeding, be it for sleeping, and little by little, like I said, we were seeing that there were more complications instead of growth and development. And that's where we decided, something's probably not right with the typical development cycle, where we sought help and then we got our diagnosis.
Tell me the story. I know the story, but I know the story. You don't know the story, but now you're going to know the story. I want you to tell the story about going to the grocery store.
Right. Okay. Well, once again, not understanding where Keaton was coming from, I would typically just go to the grocery store to take him and do some grocery shopping. And from the moment that he hit the cart and we were walking through the doors, it was screaming, it was crying, it was trying to pacify him. It was a matter of trying to figure out, I can only get to the store and buy literally 15 to 20 items. And so, and it would get worse and worse each time that we would attend. It wasn't getting any better. And we found out that he has a sensory issue, that being the motion and sensation of being pushed backwards, coupled with all the other factors of him not being able to process what was going on, just by turning our cart around, or if I had him in a baby stroller, I found that that simple change in our routine was something that actually helped him. And then slowly but surely we were making progress, that he could take more time to decipher and process what was happening. And so we had a sensory issue in that instance. That was a real barrier, but we overcame it.
And how? So what prompts you to say, I need some extra help here, and take him to the doctor?
Well, I actually had a friend that was that had some medical training concerned, and we looked online to see symptoms, and I found that Keaton would spin things, be it wheels on a car or a flower. He could do this for hours, or bottle caps, and so I thought that's really interesting. He can do that, but he can't say mama, or he won't point at anything, and he just cries, or you know, so we were finding that there were all these things that were not adding up. And I thought, is it me, or is this child, you know, everyone's allowed to develop in their own time, but it just didn't seem like it was happening. And obviously the speech was not there at all. So.
And so you take him to the doctor at what age then did you get that?
Well, at 18 months, I finally thought, you know, this is maybe a little more serious. So by 22 months, between going to different doctors and finally getting our appointment, we got our diagnosis at 22 months. And honestly, it was a huge relief for me, because I felt like, here we have an answer. It may not be a perfect answer, but now we at least have an idea of what we need to be doing and what we're working with. And so I felt like it was time to go to work.
Excellent. And I just love the way that you tell the story, in part going from this bewildered and perplexed to, oh my gosh, we have an answer. That means there has to be steps now that we can, things that I can do to help this child. When somebody comes to you and you're assessing a child, how do you help parents figure this out?
Well, we look for those core symptoms that I talked about, and we try to just collect information from a variety of sources, from the parents' observations, from teachers. We interact with the child, and you do get a sense of how they do relate to people, how they try to communicate, and how they, what their interests are. I wanted to say that, that kids with autism, there's a wide spectrum of kids that have autism. And so there are kids that have very, very severe impairments in areas, and then kids that don't. And I think one of the things to try to do is to just see the world through their eyes, because they really do experience the world fundamentally different than we do. So I once had a boy who was 17 who had rather high-functioning autism. Sort of opened my eyes up, because he said, what I really like is he called it a predetermined process. He said, I feel better when things are meaning I like things to stay the same. I like things to be predictable. Yeah. So then I sort of understood maybe that's what the spinning is about. Is it feels good to know that it's going to do at the same time. We might enjoy things being spontaneous and just things happening, that we kind of enjoy that. But to kids with autism, that's frightening. And so I think we're frightening to them. And so back to the question, it's a matter of collecting information from a variety of people and then sitting down with the parent and trying to put this in perspective in terms of development and what kids are struggling with and what they can do, and then how to help. So.
And tell me what you see. What are parents like when they first come to see you, Tahira?
Well, over the years that I worked directly with parents and children with autism, about 13 years actually, a lot of parents came in quite overwhelmed. Often they had a diagnosis, but not always. Sometimes they came in just because they wanted to explore what was going wrong with the communication or language. But often they had a diagnosis, but they didn't know what to do now, how to make it better. And so one of the wonderful things about working directly with parents is that they're like a secret weapon for a therapist, because if they'll carry out things that you give them to do, a child makes so much more progress. And so I worked with parents, and soon they were able to take these basic principles for helping kids with autism take in the information and make sense out of it and apply it to many situations that I would have never even thought of. And so it was a matter of teaching them those principles. I think once a parent is confident about parenting, it often is not as difficult. It becomes much easier. They're much more relaxed and happy in the relationship that they have and with this child. But when they feel helpless, as you were describing, when you're helpless in the grocery store and you're thinking, oh my goodness, am I never going to go to the grocery store without my child, or what am I supposed to do here?
And Keaton was your first child, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So that I had no comparison. And but I just wanted to say that once whether you have a diagnosis or not, you know, it's basically, well, what do I do to work with this child? And for Keaton, in a lot of ways, learning to communicate is like learning the second language for many of us. And it's almost as turning off the volume completely, because it's not what we were saying, it's what we were doing and what we could communicate, not so much non-verbally, but to get his attention and to create routines, as Tahara had taught us, and then work within these routines, small variations and teaching within those predictable confines is what helps to reach a child, and so that you can start even a small mundane thing of pointing or reciprocating, learning to go back and forth. The brain picks up on this, and the more that you do it, the easier it gets, and then from there it's almost exponential. It can become exponential in growth. So
I like your point that you capitalize on that child's strength in being able to do routine, and you start with that.
Right.
And they can do that, so they can work from that vantage point. And so then you just kind of grow it slow.
This is a kid who will do something over and over and
Yeah.
over, and since we know practice
Right.
makes perfect, you can capitalize on that then,
Yes.
and then just kind of sneak in a little bit of advancement.
Right. Right.
You have this wonderful website that is going to be posted on our blog, so don't worry about getting like, when is she going to post that? We're not posting it on the show, we're posting it on the blog, so you have to go to the blog then and read.
Yeah.
And you have all this wonderful good information for parents that and I know because I've been on that, and I was looking and I thought, and one of my favorites is the speak in 3-word sentences.
Yes, so a lot of parents, when their children are not talking, they talk to them more, not less, because you'd think maybe they need more exposure to language and then they'll understand it. But I often use the example of if you looked at a wall and it was just filled with thousands of postcards and you're supposed to focus in on any one, it gets hard. So we cut way, way back on the language and use much shorter sentences, and we pair language with exactly what the child is doing at that particular time. I can't remember the wording that you used, but I think of it as the predictability principle. So trying to create a predictable routine so that the child feels like, I know what this is, I know what you're going to do, I know what I'm going to do, I know how this is going to go, I know how it's going to start, and I know how and when it's going to end. If you can set up routines like that, then kids can often start to participate with you and play with you and interact with you. And once you're doing that, then you have a context in which to teach. Until they're going to join you and be part of what you're doing, you don't have any context to teach in. They're working really hard to not pay attention to you.
Well, and I think about this, and what all three of you were saying is about this notion that this has to be, the world initially is frightening for the child. And for us it would be like plunk us down in a war zone and then now teach me a foreign language. And it's like, I'm really not that interested in learning French right now.
Right. This is not.
When I feel unsafe. And so what I hear you saying is part of it is making that calming it down so that safety doesn't have to be, this is my very layperson's way of expressing it, safety doesn't have to be the first consideration.
Right.
And you simplify the sensory environment.
We simplify the sensory environment.
So the typical child room with 100 toys and bright colors and mobiles and then 1,000 things going on at once might be interesting to most kids, but not to these children. They like simple and bare bones so they can process that information, because they struggle with it, processing the sensory information.
And one of the questions we have coming in here, and I just I want to get to this, and I especially want to get to this question because Temple Grandin was in town, and the question is, what's the difference between autism and Asperger's?
Well, the current way that we diagnose is that there's a kind of a larger umbrella group of disorders we call pervasive developmental disorders, and under that there are two major categories, which is Asperger's and autistic disorder itself. And so some people refer to Asperger's disorder as higher functioning autism. But those kids and adults, it's a lifelong way of being, they tend to have more unusual, not the lack of language, but sometimes excessive language. They can be quite verbose. Lots and lots of talk, very narrow interests, and kind of have a fundamental lack of social skills. And so that's one characteristic. Then kids with the autistic disorder themselves are more classic, what I described before with the lack of social communication and the repetitive behaviors. But those are the two characteristics.
One of the issues that's always been a problem from a speech pathologist point of view is that once a child learns language, the way that these two groups were separated is if you had autism, then you were a late talker, and if you had Asperger's syndrome, then you learn language in the normal time frame, but what you said was different. But once this group has learned language, if they learn it well, they don't look any different than this group. And so, from a speech pathologist's point of view, there was no clear discriminating feature between high-functioning autism and Asperger's syndrome. Both of them had difficulties reading social cues, and both of them had difficulties with the back and forthness of communication and the nonverbals.
Tell us a little bit about how life has changed now that you know things like moving backwards is scary.
Well, before Keaton was speaking, we were really trying to embrace multiple modes of communication, be it sign language. Pictures were a very big thing for us. We used picture schedules to show his day, pictures in the car where we were going so he could see. We would try to communicate through pictures. We have technology as a support as well to communicate, and finally the verbal is coming. So we have worked very hard to have multiple modes of communication, and that they're all working together, fortunately. But our life has really come a long ways in just a couple years. It's very chilling to think, what is our life going to be like? What is going to be the future for this individual, for my child? And you can really spend a lot of energy, wasted energy, worrying too far down the road. We look back and we say, look where we are today. And we can go on an airplane, and our son can navigate through an airport, and we can go stay somewhere on vacation, and he can be away from home, and he can deal with changes in his routine. 3 years ago, that was not the situation.
And I want to add in there a little bit is that an awful lot of parents can look too far down the road and drive themselves nuts. Now, we've got 3 minutes to go. You've brought a game.
Yes,
I
want you to on play in my work an awfully lot. And part of that was so that parents could start having fun with their kids. And part of it was so that kids could use the natural mechanism of play to learn, which is the way kids naturally learn, the way animals learn. All of us can learn. So this is a game. Now, normally, if you played with a young child with a puzzle, You might take turns playing with it, but if you reached over and went to take this, and I'm a child with autism, all I see is you're taking one of my pieces, and I don't know exactly what you're going to do with it, and I wish you would leave it alone. And so, so what I often would do is show kids what I'm going to do with it beforehand, and I'll do something that's really simple and easy to read. In, 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 your turn. And they put in the last piece. So that would be a very simple, predictable way of playing. I'm also the source then of an interesting, predictable routine rather than of chaos and disruption and uncertainty. And so the games on Autism Games, which you said you put on your blog, on autismgames.org, those games are all aimed at teaching kids predictable ways to play. And of course, there's a lot of language learning involved in this as well.
And that is so different, I think, what a parent would do. A parent would do teach puzzling or let the kid play with the puzzle the way they themselves recall learning.
Or they'd say, what color is this? What color is this? What color is this? Something like that, which they can't answer. So, yes, very different.
We are at the 1 minute mark, which means we have basically no time left. In 15 seconds, Julianne, leave the audience with something.
I would say be aggressive. Don't deny. Be patient with yourself. Give yourself permission. Embrace non-tradition, and have high hopes.
Thanks again to all of you for being here. Thanks to you guests. You were wonderful. We were talking about, is the show going to be in the top 3? Easy, it was in the top 3. Don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics. There's only one topic left. There's only 1 week left, and that kind of makes me a little bit sad. You're going to read the blog so that you can get the link to Tahara's autismgames.org. Can you believe it? Next week, come back, see our last show every night, every Thursday night, 7:30 here, PBS North. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Good night.